They walked into his garage laughing, filming him on their phones, calling him old and useless. What they didn't know was that the greasy rag in his hands had once wrapped around the throttle of an F-16. He said nothing. He just kept working. But in exactly 6 minutes, everything was about to change, and none of them would see it coming. The town of Millhaven Ridge woke up slow that morning, the way it always did. Fog clinging to the hills, the smell of fresh coffee drifting out of Marlene's diner, and the steady clang of a wrench hitting metal echoing from the old garage on Route 9. Dutch Callahan had been fixing cars in that same garage for 31 years. 71 years old now, with hands that shook slightly in the cold mornings but steadied the moment they touched an engine. He wore the same faded blue coveralls every single day, the name Dutch stitched crooked over the pocket, like it had been sewn on by someone who loved him but wasn't very good with a needle. Nobody in Millhaven Ridge asked Dutch about his past. That was just how it was. He showed up. He fixed what was broken. He went home. Simple, quiet, unremarkable. Except it wasn't unremarkable. Not even close. On the far wall of his garage, behind a stack of old tires nobody ever moved, there was a photograph. Faded, curling at the corners, coated in a thin film of dust. A younger man in a flight suit, standing beside an aircraft, squinting into a desert sun. Nobody had looked at that photo in years. Nobody had asked. That morning, Rosalind Tate pulled her old Buick into the garage, the engine sputtering like it always did in humid weather. She was a school teacher, mid-40s, kind eyes, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday. "Morning, Dutch," she said, stepping out. "She's making that sound again." Dutch wiped his hands on a rag and walked around the car without a word, listening to the engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. "Belt's slipping," he said finally. "Give me 20 minutes." Across the street, Marlene Hutchins stood in the doorway of her diner watching. She'd known Dutch longer than anyone in town, nearly 3 decades, and even she didn't know the full truth, just fragments. A word here, a silence there, the way his eyes changed when a certain kind of engine roared overhead. "He's not just a mechanic," she'd say sometimes, to no one in particular. "That man's carrying something. I don't know what, but it's heavy." Nobody believed her, not really, because all they saw was an old man in oil-stained coveralls, hunched over an engine, saying maybe 10 words a day. There were small things, though, things a person might notice if they were paying close attention. The way Dutch's eyes flicked toward the door every time it opened, cataloging who walked in before they'd even said a word. The way he never sat with his back to a window. The way, every Veterans Day, he closed the garage early and drove somewhere out of town, and never told anyone where. Rosalind had asked him about it once, years ago, gently. "You ever think about opening up a little more, Dutch? This town would love to know you better." He'd just smiled that small, tired smile of his. "Some things are better left in the past, Miss Tate. Past doesn't need visitors." She hadn't pushed. Nobody ever pushed. That was the unspoken rule of Millhaven Ridge. You let Dutch Callahan be exactly as quiet as he wanted to be, and in exchange, he kept every engine in town running smooth as glass. That was about to change. Because that morning, as Dutch worked under Rosalind's Buick, a black pickup truck rolled slowly down Route 9, and it wasn't stopping for gas. It was stopping for him. The truck pulled into the garage lot like it owned the place. 3 men climbed out, moving with the kind of swagger that only comes from never having been told no that meant anything. Colton Reeves led the way. 28 years old, expensive sunglasses pushed up into gelled hair, the kind of smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. His father, Earl Reeves, owned half the businesses on Main Street, including the strip of land right next to Dutch's garage, which Earl had been trying to buy for 2 years. Dutch had said no every single time. Behind Colton walked Brody Sutter, 26, unemployed, desperate to be liked by anyone with money. "There he is," Colton said loudly, phone already raised, recording. "The mystery mechanic, still refusing to sell my dad the lot, huh, old-timer?" Dutch didn't look up from the engine. "Morning." "That's it? Morning?" Colton laughed, glancing at his friends like he was performing for an audience. "My dad offered you triple what this dump is worth. You know that, right? Triple." "Heard him the first time," Dutch said, still working. Rosalind stepped back toward her car, uneasy, watching the exchange with growing concern. She'd seen bullies before. She recognized the shape of what was happening. Brody snickered. Guy probably can't even count that high. Wade said nothing. He just watched Dutch's hands, watched how steady they were. Something about that steadiness bothered him, though he couldn't have said why. Marlene, from across the street, had already stepped outside her diner, arms crossed, watching the scene with a tightening jaw. "Colton Reeves," she called out, loud enough to carry across the lot. "Does your father know you're out here harassing an old man on a Tuesday morning?" Colton didn't even turn his head. "My father owns this whole street, Marlene. He can do whatever he wants with it, including finally getting rid of this eyesore. This garage was here before your daddy's restaurant chain had a single location," Marlene shot back. "Show some respect." "Respect is earned," Colton said, smirking at his own cleverness. "And all I see is a stubborn old man standing in the way of progress." Rosalind's grip tightened on her car keys. She'd taught enough teenagers over the years to recognize the particular flavor of cruelty that came from boys who'd never once been told no and meant it. "You know what I think?" Colton continued, circling closer, phone still recording. "I think you're scared. I think this whole silent act is just an old man who doesn't know how to let go. Sad, really." But the most shocking part was still coming. Dutch straightened up slowly, wiped his hands on the rag, and finally looked Colton directly in the eyes. There was no anger in his expression, no fear either, just a flat, unreadable calm that made Brody take an involuntary step backward. "You finished?" Dutch asked quietly. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across Colton's face, uncertainty. But he shoved it down, embarrassed, and shoved Dutch's toolbox off the workbench instead. Wrenches clattered across the concrete floor. "Pick those up," Colton said, voice sharper now. "Or maybe you're not just old. Maybe you're useless, too." Wade Kessler stepped forward then, closing the distance, something cold settling into his expression. He'd stopped filming for social media clout. Now it was something else, something uglier. "Get on your knees and pick it up," Wade said. "Old man." This is where everything changed. Because Dutch Callahan didn't move like a 71-year-old man who fixed carburetors for a living. He moved like something that had been dormant for 30 years and had just been woken up. Wade reached out and grabbed the front of Dutch's coveralls. It was, without question, the worst decision Wade Kessler had ever made. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Dutch's left hand caught Wade's wrist at an angle that instantly buckled the younger man's knees. His right hand found the pressure point just above the elbow, and Wade was on the ground before he even understood what direction the pain was coming from. Brody lunged forward, and Dutch pivoted without wasted motion, redirecting Brody's own momentum into the side of a parked truck. Brody hit the metal panel with a dull thud and slid down, stunned, blinking up at a man he'd called useless 90 seconds earlier. Colton froze. Phone still raised, recording every second of it. Dutch stood between the two fallen men and Colton, breathing steady, hands loose at his sides, like he'd just finished tightening a bolt instead of dismantling 2 grown men in under 5 seconds. "I'm going to say this once," Dutch said, voice low and even. "Pick your friends up, get back in your truck, and don't come back here." Rosalind had her phone out too now, not to film for entertainment, but because her hands were shaking and she was already dialing. "Sheriff, this is Rosalind Tate. I need you at Dutch's garage on Route 9 right now." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, adrenaline finally catching up with her. She'd just watched a 71-year-old man move faster and more precisely than anyone she'd ever seen, and some deep, instinctive part of her understood she'd witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see, something that had been locked away for a very long time. Wade groaned from the pavement, cradling his wrist, staring up at Dutch with something that had shifted from anger into raw, unfiltered confusion. What are you?" Dutch didn't answer that question either. He simply looked down at Wade with something almost like pity. Someone who's tired of young men mistaking silence for weakness. Marlene had already crossed the street, standing at the edge of the lot, staring at Dutch like she was seeing him, really seeing him, for the very first time. Colton, humiliated and furious, took a step back toward his truck, but the anger in his voice hadn't cooled. "You just made a huge mistake, old man. My father owns half this town. You think this is over?" Dutch didn't answer. He simply bent down, picked up his scattered wrenches one by one, and placed them back in the toolbox, as if the entire altercation had already been filed away and forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten. Not by Wade, groaning on the pavement. Not by Brody, still catching his breath against the dented truck, and certainly not by Colton, who climbed back into the driver's seat, glaring through the windshield at the mechanic who had just embarrassed him in front of his own recording camera. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet, because as the truck peeled out of the lot, Marlene walked slowly toward Dutch, studying his face with new eyes. "Dutch," she said carefully, "in 30 years I've never seen you move like that." Dutch closed the toolbox lid. "Wasn't planning to start today. Where did you learn to do that?" For the first time in 3 decades, Dutch Callahan hesitated before answering a simple question. "Someplace far from here," he said finally. "A long time ago." And in the distance, sirens were already approaching. Sheriff Gary Prentice arrived 11 minutes later, boots crunching over the gravel lot, taking in the scene with the tired expression of a man who'd policed this town for 22 years and had never once had to deal with anything more dramatic than a bar fight on a Friday night. "All right," he said, looking between Rosalind, Marlene, and Dutch. "Somebody want to tell me what in the world happened here?" Rosalind spoke first, words tumbling out fast. "Colton Reeves and 2 of his friends came in here, harassing Dutch, filming him, pushing him. One of them grabbed him, and Dutch just defended himself. That's it. That's all that happened." Sheriff Prentice turned to Dutch. "That how you put it?" "That's how it happened," Dutch said simply. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. He'd known Dutch for 2 decades, bought tires from him, borrowed jumper cables more times than he could count, and had never once seen anything in the old mechanic's demeanor that suggested what Rosalind had just described. "Dutch," the sheriff said slowly, "no disrespect, but you took down 2 grown men in under 5 seconds. At 71? Dutch shrugged. "Reflexes don't retire, Gary, even when the body wants to." Marlene, standing off to the side, finally spoke the words that had been sitting in her chest for years. "Gary, there's things about Dutch none of us know. I've always known it. Maybe it's time somebody found out." But the most shocking part was still coming. Because less than an hour later, Earl Reeves himself arrived at the garage, furious, loud, already threatening lawsuits before he'd even gotten out of his car. "You assaulted my son," Earl bellowed, storming across the lot in an expensive suit that looked wildly out of place against the oil-stained concrete. "I will have this garage condemned. I will have you thrown off this property so fast." "Your son and his friends trespassed and assaulted Mr. Callahan first," Sheriff Prentice cut in flatly. "There's a witness. There's likely footage on your son's own phone, given he was recording it." Earl's face reddened, but he didn't back down. "I've wanted this lot for 2 years. You think I don't know what's really going on here, old man? You've been sitting on prime real estate, refusing every fair offer, acting like some kind of local legend. Well, legends don't last forever." "It's not about the money, Earl," Dutch said quietly, speaking for the first time since the sheriff arrived. "Never was. This garage isn't just a building to me. It's the first still, quiet thing I ever owned after 22 years of noise. You wouldn't understand that. Men like you measure everything in square footage and profit margins." Earl opened his mouth to fire back, but something in Dutch's steady, unbothered tone made the words die in his throat. For just a moment, standing in that gravel lot, Earl Reeves looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a man who'd just realized he was out of his depth. Dutch said nothing. He simply watched Earl with that same unreadable calm, the same stillness that had unsettled Wade Kessler just hours earlier. It was Marlene who finally broke the tension, stepping forward with something sharp in her voice. "Earl Reeves, you ought to be careful who you threaten, because I made a call 20 minutes ago to someone who might know exactly who Dutch Callahan really is." Earl scoffed. "And who exactly did you call?" Marlene's phone buzzed in her hand at that exact moment. She glanced at the screen, then looked up slowly. "Him," she said. "Actually." Every head in the lot turned toward the gravel road, where a black government sedan was pulling in. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably official. Dutch, for the first time all day, went very still. "No," he murmured under his breath. "Not him." The sedan door opened, and a tall man stepped out, silver-haired, straight-backed despite his 75 years, wearing a plain gray suit that somehow still carried the unmistakable bearing of command. "Frank," Dutch said quietly, something shifting in his voice for the first time all day. "Dutch Callahan," the man said, a slow smile breaking across his weathered face. "You've gotten better at hiding. Took me 3 phone calls and a favor from the Pentagon to track you down." Sheriff Prentice stepped forward, badge in hand. "Sir, I'm going to need to know who you are and why you're here." The man extended a hand. "Retired Major General Frank Ashworth, United States Air Force. And I'm here because 30 years ago, this man saved 11 lives in a situation the official reports still don't fully explain, and I just found out he's been living 2 states over from me this whole time, fixing carburetors." Silence spread across the lot like a held breath. Earl Reeves, still red-faced from his earlier tirade, opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. "Wait, don't miss this detail," General Ashworth continued, voice carrying easily across the gravel lot. "Captain Callahan flew 41 combat missions before most of you were born, but that's not even the story that matters most. What matters is what happened after his service, because Dutch didn't just disappear into civilian life and forget everything he knew." Marlene stepped closer, hanging on every word. 20 years ago," Ashworth continued, "there was a fire at a chemical processing plant 3 counties over. Structural collapse, toxic smoke, workers trapped on the 3rd floor with no way out. Local fire crews couldn't get close enough. But there was a man on scene, a civilian, nobody special on paper, who went in through a service duct using training that had no business belonging to a small-town mechanic. He got 7 people out before the building came down." Sheriff Prentice turned slowly to look at Dutch. "That was you?" Dutch didn't answer. He didn't need to. "I spent 8 months trying to identify that mystery rescuer," Ashworth continued, shaking his head slowly. "Fire investigators combed through witness statements for weeks. Everyone described a man in dark clothing who moved like he'd trained for exactly that kind of chaos, who knew the building's ventilation system better than the plant's own engineers did, and then simply vanished before anyone could get his name. I only found out it was Dutch 2 years later, purely by accident, when I ran into him at a hardware store 3 counties over and recognized something in the way he was scanning the room." "You never told anyone," Marlene said softly, looking at Dutch with something between awe and quiet heartbreak. "Didn't want a parade," Dutch said. "Wanted quiet, wanted a garage, and a town that didn't ask too many questions. This town gave me that. Best trade I ever made." "He never told anyone," Ashworth said. "Changed his name after his discharge, not to hide from anything shameful, but because he didn't want the attention. Didn't want people treating him different. He just wanted to fix things. Cars, people, whatever needed fixing. You won't believe this, but the story didn't end there. Because as General Ashworth spoke, something else was happening. Sheriff Prentice had quietly pulled up county property records on his phone, cross-referencing something that had been bothering him since Earl Reeves first stormed onto the lot. "Earl," the sheriff said slowly, looking up from his screen, "this isn't the first complaint filed against you regarding land acquisition in this county. There's an open investigation from 18 months ago into forged signatures on 3 separate property transfers. I remember the case crossing my desk. It went cold because nobody could find the original paperwork." Earl's face drained of color. "Dutch," Marlene said carefully, "isn't the only one with secrets buried around here, is he?" It took 3 weeks for everything to fully unravel. The footage from Colton's own phone, the one he'd used to humiliate Dutch, became the centerpiece of an assault complaint against him, Brody and Wade. The county attorney's office, once alerted to the forged property documents by Sheriff Prentice's earlier investigation, reopened the case against Earl Reeves. It turned out Earl hadn't just wanted Dutch's land out of ambition. He'd already illegally sold rights to a development company for a strip mall that was never going to include Dutch's garage at all, forged paperwork and all. Colton Reeves, for his part, showed up at the garage one final time, alone, without his friends, without his phone raised. "I came to apologize," he said, standing awkwardly by the open bay door. "Not because my lawyer told me to, because I keep thinking about how you looked at me that day, like you weren't even angry, just disappointed." Dutch looked up from the engine he was working on. "Apology's not owed to me, son. It's owed to yourself. I've lived a long time, long enough to know the difference between a man who makes one mistake and a man who keeps choosing to be small." Colton didn't say anything else. He just nodded and left. Wade Kessler never came back to Millhaven Ridge at all. Word around town was he'd left the county entirely, unable to face the humiliation of what the whole community now knew. Brody Sutter, on the other hand, showed up quietly one Saturday and spent the entire afternoon sweeping out the garage without being asked, saying almost nothing, the way people sometimes do when words feel insufficient for what they're trying to say. Earl Reeves faced formal charges for the forged property transfers within the month. The strip mall deal collapsed entirely, and with it, a fair portion of Earl's reputation on Main Street. He kept his restaurants, barely, but the easy respect he'd once commanded around town had evaporated, replaced by something closer to wary distance. Nobody in Millhaven Ridge saw Dutch Callahan quite the same way after that. Not because he demanded it, not because he wanted the attention. General Ashworth had been right about that much. But because sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing whether you invite it or not. The town held a small gathering outside the garage a month later. No parade, no speeches, just folding chairs, coffee from Marlene's diner, and a modest plaque that read, "For 30 years, he fixed what was broken, and never once asked for thanks." Dutch stood at the edge of it all, uncomfortable with the attention, the way he'd always been. Rosalind handed him a cup of coffee. Marlene stood beside him, arms crossed, smiling in a way she rarely allowed herself to. General Ashworth had made the drive back down for the occasion too, standing off to one side in civilian clothes, looking every bit as proud as if Dutch were his own son. 30 years I've known this man," he told the small crowd, raising his own cup in a modest toast. "And in all that time, I never once heard him ask for a single thing in return for what he gave. Not medals, not recognition, just quiet. I hope this town understands what a rare thing that is." Sheriff Prentice, standing near the back with his hat in his hands, spoke up too. "Dutch, on behalf of this department, thank you, not just for what you did years ago, for staying, for choosing us." Dutch shifted uncomfortably under the weight of all those eyes, the way he always had, the way he probably always would. But when Rosalind squeezed his shoulder gently, something in his posture softened, just slightly, like a man finally allowing himself to be seen after 3 decades of practiced invisibility. "You know," she said, "this town's going to start asking you for advice now. Fair warning." Dutch almost smiled. Almost. "I just fix cars, Marlene." "Sure you do," she said. "Sure you do." That old man had seen things these boys couldn't imagine. And for 31 years, he'd carried it quietly, asking nothing of anyone, expecting even less. It took 3 strangers, 1 terrible decision, and a phone call from an old friend to finally show this town what had been standing in front of them the entire time. Nobody stood up for him that day at first, until he stood up for himself. And sometimes, that's exactly how the truth is supposed to arrive. Not with fireworks, not with headlines, just a quiet man, a garage on Route 9, and 30 years of silence finally speaking for itself. What would you have done if the quiet stranger in your own town turned out to be carrying a story like this one? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one.